All right, buckle up because today we're diving deep into some pretty heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at an excerpt from episode 155, What Are We Collapsing Into? .pdf, and,
Okay.
well, it gets pretty intense, especially for neurodivergent people.
You know, what I find so interesting about this piece is that it doesn't just talk about some political agenda.
Right.
It really connects the dots between, like, historical patterns and current political figures, and how all of this might actually play out in the lives of neurodivergent individuals.
It makes some pretty bold connections, for sure.
It does.
Like the author goes deep into this thing called Agenda 47.
Right.
And honestly, if what they're saying is true, it paints a pretty unsettling picture of what the future might look like.
Yeah, and the author argues that with RFK Jr. as the Secretary of Health and Human Services,
Okay.
this Agenda 47 could represent a really big shift in how society approaches neurodivergence.
RFK Jr., okay, so I know he's got that history with the anti-vaccine movement,
Right.
and the article mentions his ties to groups like Children's Health Defense, or CHD. And I remember hearing that they view autism and ADHD as like epidemics
Yeah.
that need to be eradicated.
It is right.
Like wiped out.
And what's really concerning is that CHD isn't just like a fringe group out there.
Right.
They've been very effective at spreading misinformation and influencing public opinion. And the article points out that they actually promote these scientifically discredited cures for autism and ADHD.
Like, what kinds of things are we talking about?
Things that have been proven to be harmful.
False.
Yeah, we're talking about things like bleach treatments, severely restrictive diets,
Wow.
and therapies that are based on punishment rather than support.
Oh my gosh.
You know, it's really like a return to a very dark time
Yeah.
when neurodivergence were seen as something to be feared and eliminated.
That's really disturbing.
It is.
I mean, are there any parallels between what CHD is promoting and what we've seen historically?
Absolutely. The author very clearly calls out the eugenicist undertones of CHD's whole approach.
Okay.
And remember, eugenics was this movement focused on improving the human population through selective breeding,
Right.
which often involved forced sterilization
Oh, wow.
and institutionalization of people that they deemed unfit.
It's hard to believe that something like that could happen in this day and age.
Well, that's exactly the point the author is trying to make.
Yeah.
They're arguing that the rhetoric coming from these groups like CHD
Right.
echoes those same justifications that were used for these eugenics programs of the past.
Wow.
And with RFK Jr., who has openly promoted these views,
Right.
in a position of power, it really raises some serious concerns about where this could all lead.
So it's like history is repeating itself,
Yeah.
but with a new target.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's not just coming from organizations like CHD.
Okay.
The article also points to this rise of what they call the martyr mom phenomenon.
Okay.
And these are parents who are often driven by grief and desperation,
Mm-hmm.
and they advocate for completely erasing their child's neurodivergence,
Oh, wow.
even if it means subjecting them to potentially abusive interventions.
That's so heartbreaking.
Is.
It's like they're so focused on fixing their child
Right.
that they just completely miss the beauty, the value in their neurodivergence.
Exactly. And the article argues that RFK Jr.'s framing of autism and ADHD as epidemics
Right.
really plays right into this mindset. It reinforces this idea that neurodivergence is a disease to be eradicated,
Right.
rather than a natural part of human diversity.
Okay, so we've got this alarming historical context and a potentially dangerous ideology gaining traction.
Yeah.
But how did this all connect back to Agenda 47?
Well, the author sees Agenda 47 as a blueprint for dismantling disability rights.
Okay.
They point to potential restrictions on stimulant medications as a prime example.
Wait, stimulant medications, you mean like Adderall and Ritalin?
Yes.
Those are literally lifelines for so many people with ADHD.
Exactly.
I mean,
and the article highlights the potential impact
right.
of restricting access to these medications.
Yeah.
I mean, we could see people struggling in school, at work, even with basic daily tasks. And what's worse is they might be pushed towards unproven,
Right.
potentially dangerous alternative treatments,
Oh.
all because the government is making it harder
Yeah.
for them to access the care that they need.
This is feeling like a really slippery slope.
It is.
It's like they're setting the stage for a system where certain people are denied access to the support they need
Yeah.
simply because of who they are.
And it's important to remember that access to healthcare is already incredibly unopened.
Absolutely.
Especially for marginalized communities.
It's true.
Imagine the impact these restrictions could have on low-income families
Right.
or communities of color who already face these significant barriers to getting adequate medical care.
It's like this perfect storm of ableism and socioeconomic disparities colliding.
Yeah.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
So where does someone like Trump fit into all of this? I mean, is he connected to Agenda 47?
Well, the author doesn't explicitly tie Trump to Agenda 47,
Okay.
but they analyze his political strategy in a way that's really relevant here.
Okay.
They discuss his use of what they call fire hosing.
Fire hosing.
Yeah, basically it means overwhelming the public with just this constant barrage of disinformation,
Right.
scandals, and policy changes.
Got it.
The goal is to keep everyone so distracted and confused that they can't effectively resist what's happening.
So it's like creating chaos as a way to push through an agenda without anyone really noticing.
Exactly.
Wow.
And along with this fire hosing, they argue that Trump has also mastered the art of projection.
Oh, yeah.
Which is essentially blaming your opponents for the very things you're doing yourself.
Classic Trump.
Right.
Seems incredibly effective.
It can be.
Yeah.
And the author argues that Trump has deliberately cultivated this chaos
Okay.
to prevent any kind of organized resistance to the policies he's trying to enact.
Wow.
They also suggest that he's systematically undermined any checks and balances on his power.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, well, the article discusses how Trump has essentially turned Congress into what they call an NPC institution.
What? Like those non-playable characters in video games that just follow a script?
Exactly.
Oh, my God.
So he's surrounded himself with these people who just do his bidding without question.
It's frightening.
It is.
If this is true, it seems like he's just methodically dismantling any potential opposition.
That's the point they're making.
Oh, wow.
And it all ties into a larger point about what kind of society is being created through these tactics.
So what are we collapsing into?
What
does the author think the end game is here?
It's not a pretty picture.
Okay.
They paint this vision of a future where society collapses into what they call a neo-feudal corporate state.
Okay.
Intertwined with Christian nationalist theocracy and fascist elements.
Whoa. Okay, that sounds like something straight out of a dystopian novel.
It does.
Can you break that down a bit further for me?
Yeah, let's start with neo-feudal corporate state.
Okay.
The author argues that we're seeing public services being systematically dismantled and replaced with corporate control. They're suggesting that eventually our survival will depend entirely on our value to corporations.
So it's like going back to the Middle Ages, where the vast majority of people were essentially serfs, serving a wealthy elite.
That's a good analogy.
Wow.
And this corporate dystopia, as the author puts it, then gets intertwined with Christian nationalist theocracy.
Okay.
So they're talking about a movement that aims to impose a very rigid social order.
Right.
That's based on a very specific and often extreme interpretation of Christianity.
And in this vision, I'm guessing anyone who doesn't fit into that narrow definition of normal would be considered a threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The author specifically points to the potential targeting of neurodivergent people and LGBTQ+ individuals. As sort of key parts of this dystopian future.
Wow.
They suggest that under this regime, alternative treatments would replace evidence-based medicine.
Oh, gosh.
Prayer and discipline would replace accommodations.
Wow.
And biblical law would replace the Constitution.
That's heavy. Yeah. It's almost too much to comprehend.
I know.
And to make matters worse, you said there are also fascist elements at play here.
Unfortunately, yes. But they argue that we're already seeing elements of one-party rule, increasing surveillance, and an ideology that's rooted in eugenics and social control.
Like they're taking the worst parts of history and fusing them together to create this absolute nightmare scenario.
It's the picture they're painting.
Wow.
And they argue that this new order just can't tolerate non-compliance, neurodivergent people by their very nature often don't fit neatly into rigid social hierarchies, which makes them a target for control and elimination.
Okay, hold on. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about Agenda 47, RFK Jr.'s potential impact on neurodivergent people. And this really frightening vision of the future. But what does this all actually mean for neurodivergent individuals in a practical sense?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And to understand that we need to delve deeper into the specific consequences that this agenda could have.
All right, well, that's exactly what we're going to do when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay.
We'll unpack the potential real-world impact of this dystopia on neurodivergent people.
Sounds good.
Stay with us. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about this, well, kind of grim potential future that's laid out in this article, especially when we're talking about neurodivergent folks. We left off on Agenda 47 and how the author claims it's basically a blueprint for getting rid of disability rights.
That's right. And when we talk about the real-world consequences of this, The authors argues that millions of people could lose access to really important medications,
Right.
like Adderall and Ritalin.
And we know that those aren't just lifestyle drugs.
No.
These are things that people with ADHD sometimes really need
Absolutely.
to be able to function in a world that wasn't designed with their neurology in mind.
Exactly. Without them, students might struggle to focus in school. Employees could have trouble meeting deadlines.
Right.
Parents might find it harder to just manage the demands of daily life.
Absolutely.
And all of this is happening while there's this increase in stigma where society is being told that these conditions are just overblown or the result of personal failings.
Yeah, it's almost like a double whammy, right?
Yeah.
Like first you're denied the tools you need to function.
Right.
And then you're blamed for struggling.
Exactly.
It's got to be so demoralizing.
And the author also points out
Yeah.
that this restriction on legitimate medication
Right.
could lead to an increase in people turning to those unproven, potentially dangerous alternative treatments that we talked about earlier.
Oh, so it's not just about making these medications harder to get.
No.
It's about pushing people toward solutions that might actually hurt them.
That's right. It creates this like perfect storm, limited access, increased stigma, and the potential for exploitation by people peddling these fake cures.
Wow, the stakes seem really high here.
They are, and the article goes even beyond just the individual level. They're saying that demonizing neurodivergence like this has some pretty serious cultural implications.
Okay.
We're talking about a potential shift in how society as a whole views these conditions.
So instead of seeing these as natural variations in how people's brains work,
right,
we're going to go back to seeing them as defects to be fixed.
Exactly.
It just seems like it's going to be so much harder for neurodivergent people to get accommodations, find a job, just receive basic medical care.
It's like taking a giant step backwards to a time when being different was seen as a weakness instead of a strength.
It's scary to think about how these policies could really hurt these groups that are already struggling.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about like Black and brown children who we know are often underdiagnosed and mislabeled as troublemakers when really they just need some extra help.
Such an important point. And the article highlights that these policies could actually worsen those racial and gender disparities that we see in diagnosis and treatment.
Wow.
And for communities that already face so many obstacles in healthcare, the consequences could be really devastating.
So we're not just talking about people losing some of their rights.
No.
This could really make existing inequalities so much worse.
That's what the author is arguing.
Wow.
And this isn't just speculation. These are concerns that are rooted in data and in historical patterns. I mean, we've seen over and over again how policies that target one group end up impacting everyone, and especially the most vulnerable people.
Yeah, it's something to think about for sure.
It is.
I also can't help but think about how this system could be abused.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like it would be so easy for whoever's in charge to exploit and control people who are already marginalized.
The author actually talks about that.
Okay.
They specifically bring up surveillance.
Right.
They suggest that with all this extra scrutiny on stimulant prescriptions and disability accommodations, could come even more government monitoring of neurodivergent people.
So it's not just about making it harder to get support.
No.
It's about tracking how people access that support.
That's exactly the concern.
Wow.
The author points to things like government databases, AI-driven monitoring,
and
even biometric tracking.
Yeah.
And they say it's all justified in the name of fraud prevention.
But wouldn't this create a system where disabled people would have to constantly prove that they deserve support? What happens to the people who can't do that?
That's a question the author leaves us with.
Okay.
And they draw some pretty disturbing parallels to Nazi Germany.
Okay.
Specifically the way they documented disabled people before the Holocaust.
Oh, wow.
It's a scary thought that something like that could happen again.
Right.
But the author makes a really compelling argument that the foundation for that is being built right now.
It's terrifying to think about.
It is.
So let me get this straight.
Yeah.
We're talking about limited access to medication, increased stigma, existing inequalities getting worse.
Right.
And the possibility of government surveillance.
That's right. The author argues that there's this deliberate effort to restrict access to resources, increase how much the government is watching people, and basically create a system where neurodivergent individuals can be excluded or even criminalized.
Okay, this is a lot.
Yeah.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, the good news is the article does end on a more hopeful note.
Okay.
Talks about resistance.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, they outline some potential paths forward
Okay.
that focus on collective action, advocacy, and refusing to be silenced.
We could all use a little bit of hope right now.
Take it, bud.
So let's dive into those solutions
Okay.
and see what we can all do to fight back against this agenda.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've painted this pretty bleak potential future, but
Yeah.
you mentioned there's hope, so I'm holding on to that.
Right.
But where do we even start? This thing seems huge.
Well, the author says pretty clearly that the resistance needs to be led by neurodivergent people.
Okay.
This isn't about allies speaking for us.
Right.
It's about neurodivergent people reclaiming our own narratives, fighting for our own rights and futures.
That makes sense, but how do we organize when it feels like the whole system is trying to keep us separated from each other?
Well, the article talks about some organizations that have been doing this work for a long time. Groups like ASAN, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, in the ADHD advocacy movement. They also talk about mutual aid, building these networks where we can support each other and share resources.
So it's about connecting with each other, drawing strengths from collective action.
Exactly. And it's not just about fighting policies. It's about really challenging the narratives that fuel these policies.
Right.
Every time someone says that ADHD is overdiagnosed
Right.
or that autism is caused by vaccines, we need to push back with the facts, our stories, and our lived experiences.
Yeah, we need to be loud and visible.
Yeah.
And refuse to let them decide who we are or what our lives should be like.
Absolutely. And while political action is really important,
Yeah.
the author acknowledges that just relying on elections has its limitations.
Okay.
They say we need to be pushing at all levels of government to make disability protections stronger.
So that means demanding that lawmakers actually enforce things like the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Exactly.
And pushing for more money to go toward research and accommodations?
Right. It also means exposing groups like CHD and stopping them from pushing these harmful ideas.
Okay.
We need to hold those in power accountable.
Okay, so we need to organize, advocate, make our voices heard. But on like a personal level, what can people do to protect themselves and their families?
The article gives a few practical tips.
Okay.
Like if you can, you might consider stocking up on medications.
Okay.
Just in case things get worse.
Right.
Keep good medical records, and be prepared if there are sudden changes in healthcare.
Okay.
It also says it's really important to learn how to advocate for yourself.
Right.
And to know your legal rights.
Got it. So it's about being prepared, knowing your rights, and having a plan if things go south.
Exactly. But honestly, the most important advice I think the article gives is this.
Okay.
Don't let them win by making you feel ashamed or like there's something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Just because you're neurodivergent.
Don't let them convince us that we're broken.
Exactly.
Just because of how our brains work.
Celebrate neurodivergence. Uplift other neurodivergent people. Keep being yourself even if the world wasn't built for you.
Yeah.
That in itself is a form of resistance.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
It feels like even with this potential dystopia looming,
Right.
there's still hope.
Yeah.
And ways to fight back.
There's always hope, and there are always ways to fight back. Neurodivergent people have always found ways to survive and thrive in a world that wasn't made for them.
It's true.
And we'll keep doing it.
That's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
This has been intense.
It has.
But also super important.
Definitely.
The stakes are high, but there's so much potential for positive change.
I agree. And I'd like to leave our listeners with this.
Okay.
Could this really happen? Could what the author describes actually become reality?
Yeah.
What signs should we be looking for?
Right.
And what can we each be doing to stop it?
That's definitely worth thinking about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Of course.
Remember, knowledge is power, so stay informed, stay connected, and stay hopeful.